If there's one thing that decades of books, movies, TV series, and video games have taught us, it's that private investigators share a few key traits: an addiction to alcohol, perpetual financial troubles, and a terrible attitude. It doesn't matter if they're human, or, as in this case, anthropomorphic cats. Albert Wilde is in fact a feline living in a city populated by animals, and he works, more or less, as a private investigator, though he actually prefers to spend his time gambling. His gambling debts force him back into detective work, dragging him into a seemingly inexplicable murder case, just as inexplicable as the victim's appearance. As the story unfolds, various seemingly unrelated events begin to intertwine, resulting in an unlikely blend of noir, sci-fi, and comedy. The mix works fairly well, and to me, it felt like a game that could have been conceived and directed by Ed Wood. Overall, Albert Wilde's story brings together every possible stereotype from these genres, leaning heavily on comedic and surreal situations. Unfortunately, the plot takes a while to find its rhythm and is mostly held together by individual scenes, featuring often witty dialogues, though some of them do cross the line into excessive verbosity. The game is essentially a first-person narrative adventure. After the initial phases, you'll be given a map, which gradually expands with new locations to visit and characters to interact with. The difficulty is virtually non-existent, as 90% of the gameplay consists of talking to characters, gathering new information that unlocks additional locations or people to meet. About a third of the way into the game, you'll acquire a particular sci-fi gadget that, in theory, should add some extra possibilities, but in reality, it doesn't contribute much. Of course, this isn't necessarily a negative aspect, just something to consider when deciding whether the game suits your personal tastes. There are also two arcade-style sections, which are technically quite rough in execution, but fortunately can be completed quickly without much trouble. Finally, the overall playtime is around 7 to 8 hours. There are games with objectively bad graphics, and then there are games that deliberately aim to look bad, but do so with style. Albert Wilde belongs to the latter category. The character models are rough, animated only as much as necessary, while the environments often feel uninspired. But again, this isn't an unintentional flaw, it's a deliberate, artistic choice. The final result, though intentionally rough, has its own unique charm and fits perfectly with the game's surreal noir atmosphere. The entire game is also accompanied by a visual filter reminiscent of old silent films, which could potentially cause some eye strain. Fortunately, interactive points are clearly marked and impossible to miss. Most of the game is purely text-based, with the various characters expressing themselves through the sounds of the animals they are modeled after. It's a peculiar and fitting choice, though unfortunately, it quickly turns into a double-edged sword, especially with certain animals, whose sounds are more grating than others. Albert's internal monologues, on the other hand, are voiced normally, with a deliberately exaggerated and stereotypical tone, just as one would expect in a game of this kind. The soundtrack, unfortunately, fails to stand out in any way, offering thematically appropriate but sadly unremarkable tracks. Albert Wilde is a peculiar title. Its narrative adventure structure works despite a few stumbles in the dialogues and the occasional arcade sections, but it's primarily its presentation that stands out, delivering a game worth recommending, provided players know exactly what they're getting into.